Dan the Artman's Book Reviews, Episode 81, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, by Agatha Christie. While it seemed like a bit of a mix between The Great Gatsby and a Sherlock Holmes novel, I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. Just as I felt the book was becoming a bit dry, the murder happened. And no, that's not a spoiler if you know this genre. I must say, I don't actually know the mystery genre well, but have always wanted to get into it, thus my reading of this book. I have read one other of her books a few years ago, And Then There Were None, which I quite enjoyed and rated 4 out of 5 stars. It was an interesting thing to find that the narrator in this story was interested in becoming a detective, yet it was another character, Poirot, who does the investigation. I was expecting it to be the narrator character, but then it was like, duh, the series is named after Poirot. I'm just saying that's the way the story led me at first. I suppose it shouldn't surprise me, as it's a lot like Sherlock Holmes and even The Great Gatsby, where the protagonist is not really the narrator or main character. I'm sure varying definitions of those terms would lead to disagreements with how I worded that, but I'd wager you understand what I mean. I quite enjoyed Poirot's interviews with people. I liked how he differed a bit as a detective from Sherlock Holmes. He has perhaps less powers of deduction and more a talent for thorough investigation, where he follows his process and finds things out in that manner. I never disliked Holmes' amazing deductions, but it was cool to see Poirot go to work in action rather than puffing on a pipe to solve the case almost exclusively in his mind. Edit. Upon further reading, I saw Poirot use great powers of deduction to help him solve the case, and much like Sherlock Holmes, he definitely reveals all in a huge avalanche of information at the end. I think I wrote some of this review while reading the book. Anyway, here's maybe the difference though. While Poirot is sharp, he is also surprised by things and must work them out as he finds new evidence. We get the sense that Poirot is making some amazing deductions as the story progresses, and while he might have solid conclusions, he continues to work on the case. I liked that sense of movement. It is very similar to Sherlock Holmes, but he also does it in his own way with his method. It is heavily inspired by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's writings, but has a different flavor. I really like the character of Poirot too, as he is described as a small man. He seems not to be physically imposing, but his demeanor still is one of confidence and assuredness. He's a cool character. I look forward to more books with him in them. I enjoyed the narrator, Mr. Hastings' observations about how the characters handled the death. Richard Armitage did a great job narrating this book. His variation for the different characters brought a lot of life to the dialogue, and there was a lot of dialogue, so he was a great choice for this book. It cracked me up how Mr. Hastings would get annoyed with Poirot and his elusive knowledge of the crime that Mr. Hastings couldn't guess at. Overall, I enjoyed it. Alright, cool. Yeah, I guess this just shows that I must have liked And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie's crime mystery novel enough to try another one of her novels. And I think the first time I read anything by her, I purposefully chose a standalone novel, and then once I knew I liked her writing and her storytelling, then I was ready to try a series. You might have heard I'm listening through all of the Dresden Files books right now, which are modern, like urban fantasy, but the main character is a private investigator, and so that's really cool. And now, having read some of the original kind of detective noir novels, I can just see why someone would want to dip their toe into that world, but then bring it forward into a modern setting. And then what's so cool about the Dresden Files is that he's also a wizard. And all that comes along with that, with all the different magical creatures that exist in Harry Dresden's world. that story is far removed from this, but they're both a series of mystery novels. One thing that I'll always remember about reading through this book, or actually listening to it, is the place that I was in life while listening to it. We had just moved to Guatemala, and I don't know, we'd been here maybe less than a year, so I was learning Spanish and trying really hard to learn the culture here. But it was also nice to try and find some time to listen to audiobooks and fiction, to just dip back into my own culture. Because everyone here speaks Spanish and is super warm and friendly, and the culture is amazing, but it's very different from my American culture. And then listening to this by a British narrator was so cool because it was such a different culture than my own, and in a very different time period where people speak so differently than we do now, even though we still speak English. It's just like how we speak a very different English than people in Great Britain. So I was just thinking a lot about culture and cultural differences while listening to this book. I remember specifically one day I was listening to it while my wife and I were waiting in line for a very long time to get a little sticker that we could put on our car so that we could park in downtown Antigua, Guatemala. And while I didn't enjoy being a little warm and waiting in line for a long time, at least I got to pass the time listening to some pretty old, to me, British dialogue that was witty and fun, and honestly just a very different story than I'd ever listened to before. Because unlike kind of like that cozy murder mystery from her other novel that I've listened to, and then there were none, where everyone shows up to one setting and it's like, who murdered the person? This one was a detective solving the crime. Again, I'd highly recommend the audiobook, and I think that's all I have to say about that. I look forward to diving back into this series one day, and until then, thanks for listening, and happy reading.
This podcast is brought to you by dandantheartman.com, where you can find more book reviews, entries on Dan's writing journey, and links to purchase Dan's books, like Haunted House Flipper or The Case of the Missing Snowman. Music by Dan Absalonson.